What's good? It's Woog. I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the Beatles, as if the topic of the Beatles hasn't been beaten ad nauseum, right? It just feels like it never gets old talking about the Beatles because there's so many different aspects or eras within the Beatles run that you could talk about, certain albums, songs, members, and there's been endless coverage. I mean, I love that, anthology documentary. I love all of these different, commemorative, magazines, special issues. I'm never too far from some Beatles related literature. And I feel like listen over listen. Anytime you get into one of their albums, it could be anything from, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band to, Beatles for Sale. You will find something else to appreciate, or you just hear something in a slightly different way and you pick up on something that you weren't really perceptive of before. So in this particular video, I want to acknowledge an observation, and this might already be pretty widely held. I mean, look, if you ask like 20 different Beatles fans what their favorite Beatles album is, you'll probably get several different responses. And, and if you ask any particular individual one day what their favorite Beatles album is, it might change from year to year or from month to month. I could give you one answer today, and the general answer that I've had in terms of my favorite Beatle album has been Revolver. But if you were to ask me at the right time, it could be Abbey Road or the Magical Mystery Tour. But one thing that I've kind of found to be true is that the most important Beatles album is Rubber Soul. Now, this doesn't necessarily make it its best or their best, or it doesn't mean that it's my favorite Beatles album. But if we're looking at the trajectory of the Beatles' career and we're looking at the history of rock and roll, I feel that it's almost undeniable that the most pivotal album that they released, largely because it was so transitional, is Rubber Soul. Now, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is usually the album that's like their Mona Lisa. That's kind of the album that, like Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon or the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. Even though the Beach Boys, if you were to ask 20 different people what the best Beach Boys album is, most are going to gravitate towards Pet Sounds just because the narrative and basically a lot of the critics and the publications and so forth, widely recognize Pet Sounds as like one of the greatest, rock albums of all time. You don't get so much unanimity when it comes to like acknowledging Sgt. Pepper's as the greatest Beatles album. But in most publications, you'll see it ranked the highest. And if you don't see that one, you might see Revolver or in some cases Abbey Road. But if you were to look at the Beatles' career and, you had their early era where they were just cranking out number one hit after number one hit. First in the UK, then they came to the US in '64. The iconic Ed Sullivan performance, which put them on the map in their tremendous concert in Shea Stadium. So you first had the early hits where it was like, Love Me Do, I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You. And then you got into the next phase, which, by the way, there are countless Beatles hits from around this time. And there are also a lot of non-hits album cuts that are phenomenal as well, like Do You Want to Know a Secret? That's a beautiful song. And then a little bit later on, you get into the 8 Days a Week, Can't Buy Me Love, and before that, you had Twist and Shout. And then in late 64 to 65, you had, the album Hard Day's Night with the number one single, A Hard Day's Night. Oh, by the way, another one of my early favorites was All My Loving. I love that song, just the melody in that one. And then you had like I Feel Fine, and that was the number one song. That was actually a non-album single, I Feel Fine. Just, tons of goodness on that Hard Day's Night album. And then you had the Help album where you had the song Help, you had a Ticket to Ride, the classic Yesterday, which is one of the best like rock ballads of all time. So you had different eras even within the first half of the Beatles' career. I mean, just because they were so prolific during that couple of years, 63 to 64 going into 65. And then after that Help album, you had Rubber Soul, where for the first time the album was treated something as, greater than the sum of its parts. Before this, you basically had an album which was, whatever hit songs they had at the time, and then whatever covers you're going to include on there. Basically filler to try to make something's duration long enough so then you could market and sell that as an album. But it was never conceptually based. There wasn't a ton of thought that went into the different artwork, the sequencing of the track list. All of these different things took place basically with Rubber Soul. In fact, Rubber Soul is what inspired the Beach Boys' Brian Wilson to want to do something to perhaps be on par with or exceed that. So it inspired him to create Pet Sounds. He wanted his own Rubber Soul. So after Rubber Soul, rock and roll and the way that the album was treated was way different than everything that came before Rubber Soul. So when you look at the album in rock and roll, there is before Rubber Soul and there's after Rubber Soul. I mean, just look at the cover of Rubber Soul. It was, kind of expanded where everybody on the album is just kind of stretched out. Plus, they were kind of getting away from all of the songs being about boy-girl relationships kind of in the bubblegum pop sense. They became way more existential, particularly John Lennon. I look at this as being John Lennon's greatest stride of growth as a songwriter. Like Paul McCartney would go on to be more prolific overall, and he would improve too. But I look at John's songs on Rubber Soul as actually being better and showing more growth than Paul's songs on Rubber Soul. You could pick an album, anytime after that point, and you'll probably get Paul McCartney kind of taking the lead. Anything from White Album to Sgt. Pepper's, even though John Lennon obviously had his great songs and moments. Every album after this point, George Harrison as well had his big moments. But at the time of Rubber Soul, instead of all of the I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves Me, yeah, 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 and all of those quintessential boy-girl love songs, you see John Lennon, he doesn't waste any time. Track 2 of the album is Norwegian Wood, which, yes, it is about man-woman relationships, but it's about man-woman more so and not so much boy-girl. Listen to the complexity, listen to the nuance, listen to the subtlety and kind of the hidden language. He uses metaphor in a lot of these songs from this point going forward, so he's getting a lot more heady with the songwriting. And this is where George Harrison plays an out-of-tune sitar for the first time, and that sitar makes its way into Norwegian Wood. This was the first sign of things to come in that regard, use of the sitar in Beatles music. And this is still a couple years before they went out to India with the Maharishi and had that whole experience in constructing what would become the Beatles album, later known as the White Album. This is still way earlier than that. But if you look at even their faces on the Rubber Soul cover, it is clear that by this point, they are bona fide potheads. This isn't artists smiling or looking a certain way. They all look kind of contemplative, reflective, and you could hear that type of existential approach in, again, John Lennon in particular, because he kind of outpaced them in terms of complexity, conceptually and nuance in his songwriting. Again, Paul would later make his strides, and you would see Paul demonstrate this in several cases. Same thing with George Harrison. But on Rubber Soul, the George Harrison songs that appear on Rubber Soul are Think for Yourself and If I Needed Someone. Now, I like If I Needed Someone, and Think for Yourself is pretty good as well, but you wouldn't ever say that that's on par with some of the George stuff to come later on, like Something, or Here Comes the Sun, or While My Guitar Gently Weeps. You get what I'm saying? He still had a lot more growing as a songwriter to do. Paul McCartney, to me, wasn't at his best in this Rubber Soul album. He had songs like You Won't See Me, Michelle. Now, Michelle's a great one. I know that is as good as anything, right? Michelle, even though, ironically, Michelle is actually something that he had written well before they started recording Rubber Soul. That was one of Paul's first tunes that he created. And it ended up manifesting in Michelle, which is an absolute, Beatles classic. But then Paul McCartney also did I'm Looking Through You, which is a good song as well. But again, not necessarily on par with some of the stuff to come, even though a lot of their recording techniques started to kind of shift around this time as well, using more feedback and fuzz in the guitar. Listen to the guitar on John Lennon's brilliant, existential Nowhere Man, which was one of the first signs that, John was really getting getting more heady and taking more creative chances in his songwriting. It's not about boy and girl. It's actually something that's written about himself, but it's projected as if it's written in third person. He's a real nowhere man, making all his nowhere plans. That brilliant song. Again, this was really ahead of his time when you talk about the different concepts that rock and roll artists were featuring in their songs. Now, you had different jangle applied to guitars right around this time from the LA band, the Byrds, who Beatles inspired the Byrds, who then in turn re-inspired the Beatles. And, there was a lot of that. Same thing with the Beach Boys and the Beatles. There was a lot of back and forth inspiration, even though, the Beatles started before the Byrds. The Byrds had that jangle guitar sound with their rendition of, even Mr. Tambourine Man, because this is before like Sweethearts of the Rodeo, before David Crosby bounced from the group. This is when they were in their Turn, Turn, Turn and Mr. Tambourine, where the guitar started to sound different on rock and roll tracks. So if you listen to like the guitar on some of the passages in like Nowhere Man, you'll get to see that use of the new jangle guitar sound, which, a lot of indie rock kind of, derive later on in different variations of post-punk and, different subgenres. In fact, the Beatles would use some more nuanced guitar sound down the line. Like on the very next album, Revolver, you hear it in the opening to the song And Your Bird Can Sing. Listen to how they come in with that, with George Harrison's guitar and how that sounds. Well, you hear some of that new guitar sound on Nowhere Man. And again, his songwriting on this song and then on In My Life just hit a new level. Again, very existential, very contemplative. In My Life is probably one of my 3 favorite Beatles songs in their entire discography. In My Life is just a beautiful, simple, but a beautiful song, which features what sounds like a harpsichord, but it's actually George Martin, their longtime producer, playing, on piano, and then they speed it up to sound like a harpsichord, and that's like that little passage, 2/3 of the way into In My Life. And again, I look at In My Life as being like the centerpiece, the best song on Rubber Soul. In fact, the only real misstep on the album is like the kind of hideous to listen to, especially in today's, in context, Run For Your Life. It's the very last song of the album, and it's actually written by John, and he's not even very proud of it, or wasn't proud of it when you listen to what he had said about the song afterwards. Like, it was kind of a throwaway track that managed to make the end of the album. It sounds kind of it sounds abusive. Like, you could just look at the words in the chorus on paper and say, damn, where are you going with this one, John? But it's basically about, male insecurity, but it's manifested in all the wrong ways. Another John Lennon song on this album is Girl. Now, this one is about boy-girl, but like Norwegian Wood, it takes a more mature approach to the topic, and it's a lot more cynical. Like, it's not lovey-dovey, and it's not as black and white and simple as, oh, we're either madly in love or you broke my heart and done me wrong. No, it's a lot more nuanced. You listen to how he's portraying, her behavior and her perception of herself and how that comes out, and it's just brilliant, and again, way ahead of its time. So again, you might see different Beatles albums as being better than Rubber Soul. You might like more songs on Revolver or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And I mean, damn, is there any denying the Beatles album, the White Album, that doesn't have more good songs than any other Beatles album? I mean, just based on the pure volume, and then you couple that with the quality of the songs, yes, the White Album is phenomenal, and it's got more good songs than any other Beatles album. But I think that Rubber Soul is not only the best John Lennon album, because again, this is where he makes his greatest leap, and he is just absolutely shining in his songwriting on this album, but I think that this is the most important Beatles album. There would be no Revolver if they weren't going into this transitional Rubber Soul phase. Again, they had done a lot of different things even leading up to this point. They had dabbled in, the folk rock, where, what was that John Lennon written song? You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. That was early Beatles work, but he was channeling his inner Bob Dylan, and the Beatles being influenced by Bob Dylan can't be understated either. In fact, he's the one who introduced them to marijuana. So he really, literally, and through his work, changed the way that they thought about music and largely the way that they thought about life. And it really comes out on this Rubber Soul album. Phenomenal album. Give it a listen. Again, from top to bottom, minus the very last song of the album, Run For Your Life. From the beginning, I mean, the opener, Drive My Car. Now, that's like kick the party off type of song. It's not as, heady or existential as some of the stuff that come later on in the album, but it's a great album opener. It's a fun album opener. And even that song kind of talks about, the duplicitous nature in relationships. You could drive my car, and her kind of seeing herself in this way, she wants a star and nothing less, and I'll accommodate that. Can I be your chauffeur in the meantime? And, maybe I am kind of underselling the Paul McCartney led songs. You Won't See Me is more mature than earlier Paul McCartney written songs. And I'm Looking Through You certainly is. So they were all kind of growing mentally and psychologically. And again, by this time, they were smoking a lot of herb and taking more creative leaps and chances musically. It just comes out beautifully. I like to listen to artists' discographies almost in succession. I would encourage anybody who wants to get into the Beatles to really start at the beginning, so you could see the strides that they were making over time, and you can see how tight a window some of those stretches were. I mean, this is less than a year after the back-to-back, Hard Day's Night and then Help albums. So again, Beatlemania was about a year ago at the time they dropped Rubber Soul. So you had other artists coming in and challenging that early 60s sound of rock and roll, like the Byrds and other bands. But the Beatles then said, okay, you newcomers just did this with rock and roll and took it to this next level. Now we're gonna reassert the cutting edge stuff with this album. And then I believe rock and roll kind of pivoted, and a lot spawned from that Rubber Soul album. But yeah, let me know what you think about the Beatles discography. What is your favorite Beatles album? Who's your favorite Beatles member? I feel like they all kind of peaked at different times, and Paul is obviously the most prolific. I think he was their most consistent. Like his Beatles catalog, and this is even before his solo stuff and the stuff with Wings and so forth. Just the stuff that Paul McCartney wrote for the Beatles could be like a songbook, a fake book of rock and roll classics. You know what I mean? So he wins the songwriting battle based on how prolific and how brilliant many of those songs were. I mean, from early, middle, and end of the Beatles run. I mean, he finished it off with stuff like Hey Jude and Let It Be, right? But Rubber Soul is where John Lennon truly comes into his own as a next level, kind of thinking outside the box, cynical type of songwriter. But yeah, let me know what your favorite Beatles album is, and do you agree that that Rubber Soul is the most important, regardless of what you think is the best or your favorite or this or that, the most important Beatles album in that catalog? Let me know in the comments, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.